Welcome everyone to Raise the Roof. This is our second episode of our 7-part series tackling atheist ethics. So today, my co-host Leroy Hill and I are once again joined by our atheist friend Richard Suttles, also known as the Fallen Ape Theist, to tackle Edward O. Wilson's argument, sometimes better known as E.O. Wilson, his argument about human nature from the book Modern Ethics in 77 Arguments. We'll explore the atheist view of humanity through Wilson's chapter, which is titled Evolution and Our Inner Conflict. Richard's going to help us answer these questions. Can an atheist or can atheism help us decide between altruism and selfishness? So that is our setup. So welcome, gentlemen, Leroy, Richard. All right, Richard, how you doing, brother? Everything all right?
Man, I'm doing great. This is our second show together, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm doing great. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's good to have you back. Leroy, I know you're a tired man, lots of driving. You going to be awake for today?
I'm going to be awake for today. I was on the road 8 hours yesterday.
That's crazy. Always, that's a lot, man. That's a lot, brother. Yeah, so I'm actually pretty good. I had my coffee this morning. I'm ready to go.
We didn't ask you how you were doing.
Yeah, I know.
Right? Really
Nobody asked me. I don't care. But I'm not sure it matters to me. But I am doing great. For anyone who does care, sitting here on my couch next to my pup, little Juju, hanging out with me and looking forward to this conversation. Feels like a long time between these conversations, but I'm also glad for it too, because it gives us time to really think and digest and follow up with ideas and really digest things. So I'm kind of, one hand, wish it was faster. The other hand, glad for the extra time between them. So, Richard, let me kick this to you. I'm going to have you do something that I normally do the setup, and here's the summary, and here's the concepts when we do our show. But because we're trying to feature atheist arguments, and you're an atheist, I thought it'd be better to have you maybe do the summary. What is Wilson's point? What are his big ideas that he's trying to get across in this chapter about this inner conflict that he describes? And then after Richard, I have you unpack that just so folks know. Then we'll start to dive in and say where Richard's different from that, where he's the same as we've done in the past. That's our plan. And we're not assuming because he's an atheist, he shares these same views. We just want to use this as a framework so people can prep ahead of time, read these arguments, see where we're going to go, and then think through their own types of questions. So with that, Richard, let me kick it to you and kind of give your thoughts and summaries of ideas.
Okay. So, man, again, thanks for having me. I'm glad that I'm the one that's introducing E.O. Wilson, because there's a lot of atheists out there, especially online and popular social atheists, who talk about how morality works. And most of them go by Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, which was a very world famous book and still is, and was still very well written. But Richard Dawkins and most atheists will say that we have the selfish gene, but sometimes that selfish gene will push us to be reasonable or to be social. And that explains morality is just this selfish desire to, you're selfish, but you're selfish towards other people. And there's no intention there. That's been Richard Dawkins' main theme, and a lot of atheists join in on with that. E.O. Wilson is also, or was, he passed away, but he was also a biologist, very probably close in age to Richard Dawkins, and I think they even talked a lot and just heavily disagreed with each other. But E.O. Wilson has a much different view. He agrees that, yeah, there's some self-interest in our genetics, but he also says that there's some cooperative and altruistic genetics going on with us too. And he explains that by saying, in the same way that you might have your feelings towards your offspring. So, and you guys know kin selection, and other atheists have talked about kin selection too, is that you're selfish. A lot of atheists will say you're selfish towards yourself and then towards your siblings or towards your parents, because it's still your genes. The genes are centric there, or central there. E.O. Wilson is saying you can also have that same intense bonding towards members of your community. And that this is the reason why we all have this tendency to want to be in a group. I personally have a slightly different twist on that, but I think it's good to say, in fact, the three of us all said this in our podcast last month, is that everybody wants to be in a community. there's some caveat to that, but I think that that's true. We all want to be in something like a community. So E.O. Wilson was saying that this concept of his is called multi-level selection. I'm going to throw out some books here real quick on screen. The Social Conquest of Earth, there, E.O. Wilson. And then another book that he wrote called The Meaning of Human Existence. And of course, anyone who wants to read the very, very short essay that Joe was just talking about, we can put a link to that in the comments. But that was an article or an essay he wrote in 2012. You can read it in 10 minutes. And that would be a very, very quick summary of the books I just showed you. But the phrase that E.O. Wilson talks about is called multi-level selection. And I'm going to show you one more book that you can read. This is called Agents and Goals in Evolution. This author is a different author. His name is Samir Okasha. He also talks about multi-level selection. And now that E.O. Wilson has passed away, anyone out there who wants to hear about multi-level selection, I would listen to Samir Okasha now, because he's the one who's tweaking it and doing research specifically on that. But multi-level selection is different than Darwinian selection, rather than just each living organism is competing against everybody else, and then whatever it takes for you to still be here, that gets reproduced. And so there's a biological pressure to be whatever it takes to be a winner. Even Darwinian evolutionists don't always think that means might makes right. Whoever, survival of the fittest is not always whoever's the most merciless or whoever's the most brutal. But whatever it takes, Darwinian evolution is saying whatever it takes to still be here, those genetic traits get passed down to your offspring. What multi-level selection says is that there's other dimensions to that too, where groups of species are competing against other groups of species, and the species that cooperate more tightly together will outcompete their peers in other communities. So like a colony of ants that cooperate better together will outcompete a whole other colony of ants, which is a different species, just because their cooperative output, their cooperative effort, the collective effort that they have together is what causes them to survive. And so in this case, if you think about ants, and ants are a really good example of this. Some ants now, millions of years later, can't even reproduce. They're female, and they're not even designed anymore to reproduce, because the queen is the only one who can have kids. In fact, if there's ever a biological mistake and one of the ants that's not the queen has kids, all the ants stop what they're doing and go and just kill all of that, and then go back to what they're doing, because they're like, nope, you're not the one who has kids. So every ant is not only has like a part to play within the colony, they're now getting biologically designed, where some are like born to be a warrior, and some are born to build, and some are born to go and look for things. They're biologically different, even with the same DNA, to help with that colony. So this multi-level selection concept is arguing that it's not just the individual's genes competing against other individuals, it's the community's genetics competing against the genetics of other communities. That's the real quick overview of what E.O. Wilson is doing. And he's saying that all of us who feel conflict, sometimes you feel conflict like, hey, I want all this money, or, I want all these resources. But at the same time, I'm also feeling like a bond towards this other person, and I want them to do well, so I want to help them too. And he was saying that struggle that we feel is explained biology. It's not, in his mind, he's saying it's not like a demon saying, hey, let's go get the money, versus an angel saying, hey, let's go be nice. It's biological systems competing with each other. So he's agreeing that we feel this tension, but he's saying that that's explained biology and not by the supernatural.
Okay, good. Pretty good summary. Leroy, any thoughts to add to that on your take on Wilson's argument?
The first question that I always come back to with Wilson or anyone else making that argument is, why should we? It's not a matter of that we. I mean, that we do X or Y, or that we cooperate or not cooperate. The question is, why should we? Why assume that we should? And then why try to build an argument around should, or that we do, rather than why should we do? I mean, for me, the question is, I mean, why is murdering not as good? Why is murdering wrong, and why is not murdering right? I mean, on Wilson's view, it's just preference, and it always boils down to preference. I mean, why should communities survive? I was reading a book by a guy named Peter Berger, and Peter Berger talked about the Incans and how their whole society was built around their king. His name was Aholtepec. When Pizarro came in, he killed the king. And when he killed the king, Incan society collapsed, even if they didn't know it at the time. And the question, that brings is, okay, why? So, I mean, so what? What should we take from that? I mean,
Yeah,
if we want to argue for a moral reality, then I can see, I can make a case for why we should take what we should take from that. But if we're not really arguing for objective morals, I mean, I don't know that we should take anything from it if they don't exist.
Yeah, we definitely covered some of that territory last time. We talked about, is morality tied to our biology? Is it separate and distinguished? So I'm just saying that so folks, some of what Leroy is bringing up here, we did dive into a little bit last time. Let me just say a couple thoughts on Wilson's argument. Then I'm going to kick it back to you, Richard, and see where you really agree or might disagree with him. My take is I think you largely agree with Wilson, at least the way I understand your views, but I'm open to hearing any differences or different takes with your songbird stuff or the culture side of things. I'm not sure how that fits in with Wilson, but I do think people have to understand, he's talking about that dualist nature. There's the selfish side, there's the cooperative side. And for Wilson, there's that competition on the individual level. There's also the group-centered competition. And these forces, he says, are irreconcilable. You'll never reconcile the two. There's always a tension, a necessary tension, in terms of the survival impulse that we biologically have. And so there can't be any political system that reconciles these. There can't be any religious system that reconciles these. It's a necessary part of who we are. And efforts to, I guess, suppress one of these sides are really going to always be doomed to fail, because it's just nature will bring them back up. That's sort of my short version take, just to add what Richard said, which was already a good summary. So I won't try to reframe anything else he said, because I think that's fine. So Richard, real quick though, anything where you really say, okay, here's where I'm different from Wilson on, or here's where, maybe even explain a little bit your idea how we all have this desire, and the little song that we hear, the culture thing. Because Wilson would argue that culture isn't going to override that. It's still a biological, the cooperative thing that we produce. Culture is that part of that cooperative biological drive. Any thoughts to that? Is that where you pretty much stand? Is that a fair summary of your view as well?
My view is very close to E.L. Wilson. And I'll say what my view is. I just wanted to bring up that movie. I think it was called An Ant's Life, or maybe A Bug's Life. I forget now which cartoon it was, but in that cartoon, it's about an ant, and of course, that whole colony is all about the queen, and everybody has a job to do. And one of the individual ants, is like, well, what about me? What about my dreams? And so, like you're saying, it's irreconcilable. It was irreconcilable. He wanted his own life, to do his own thing. He didn't want to do what the colony had planned for him, which really resonates with the audience. But for the ants, you can't be like that. You can't have ant rights, individual ant rights in a colony. Your job is to be part of the colony, and they are irreconcilable. In terms of whether or not there's a political system, and this will get into my beliefs, I think Thomas Sowell probably figured out the right political system. Both of our current political parties today mutilate that concept. They both hate him now. but I think there is a possible political system where you do try to at least take these competing urges that you want to take care of yourself, but you also have compulsions to help with your community as well. So the book by Thomas Sowell is called A Conflict of Visions. He wrote it back in the 80s. He's still alive today. Of course, he's in his 90s and he's retired. But if you're looking for at least a philosopher, if you want to call him a philosopher, if you want to think of a great mind who's trying to come to terms with these competing compulsions, I would say A Conflict of Visions is a really good book. Even though it was written decades ago, it's still very relevant today. And then in terms of my only difference with E.O. Wilson is that I think there's three compulsions. And I think you do have your compulsions to take care of yourself. That's one. And then your second compulsion is to cooperate with other people. And then your third one is for zealotry. And we brought this up last time where for zealotry, that's your meaning system. And I say that everybody has a meaning system. Even someone who says, no, I'm a nihilist, nothing matters. That same person won't shut up about it. And I'm like, okay, you're saying nothing matters, but yet you're dying to make me understand you. So something matters. It could just be your view of nihilism. So I say that everybody has that meaning system. So you have this compulsion to be a zealot for that. And when it's a compulsion for that, it's not a preference or an opinion. When you're following your zealotry, a preference and opinion is your favorite ice cream or your favorite movie. And you meet somebody with a different favorite ice cream and a different favorite movie. And you're like, oh, okay, cool. Tell me about it. You're not angry. It doesn't go against your who you are. But if their zealotry is different, if you get a violation against the thing that you're a zealot for, you freak out. And that is not just religion. Think about an atheist who says there are some atheists who say we need to just wipe religion off the map. We need to just stop being religious. There are some atheists who think like that. And when they see anybody talking about God, like, hey, I lost somebody today, I hope they're in heaven, that atheist is going to run over there and say, there's no heaven, there's no God, wake up. Because you've violated his zealotry. His zealotry is that all religion needs to go away. And so you violated his zealotry. So he jumps in, and it's not a preference or an opinion. It's his zealotry. Now, again, to him, I know what Leroy's saying is that if there's not an objective standard by which we judge, then it's all our own experiences. I'm just saying that from our experiences, we draw a dividing line between preferences and opinion on this side. Actually, I don't know. I'm not visually in the camera. Preferences and opinion on this side, whereas our meaning and our morality is definitely on this side. Even if it is subjective, even if it's not based on an objective standard, we absolutely perceive that. And so that's my view. I think we have those three forces constantly fighting with each other, and then we just kind of have to navigate through that.
So Leroy, let me kick that back to you then and respond to what Richard's offering there, and if you see any distinction there. But I want to approach this a little bit differently, make sure that there's a clarity of contrast between what you're talking about, objective moral standards, versus what Richard is dialoguing about, what we've covered from his atheist perspective. So I'm going to do that through the framework. We've got a question on our YouTube channel from Calming Waves Julian, and he has sort of a multi-part little response here. He's saying, I don't think we get to choose, Leroy. He's talking about these moral choices. Some parents abandon their children, but you don't. We don't get to choose. And then he says, God gives humans a moral principle in the Good Samaritan parable. You must help a dying person by the roadside, but God doesn't always help dying people by the roadside. So then he concludes, if God doesn't follow the moral principle of the Good Samaritan, I don't think even with a God, even if there is a God, you can't show that there's an objective moral truth out there. Now, this gets a little bit more towards meta-ethics, the objective reality, which Wilson, just for people following along, Wilson really isn't getting into a meta-ethical principle. He's just sort of saying, here's the way it is. Here is the is of the world and of the reality. He's not trying to explain this larger picture. So we are unpacking two things. I don't think we're bound to limit ourselves to what Wilson is doing here, but I just want to distinguish or pull apart those two concepts. Wilson's describing what is. What Richard has described so far is, here's the way it is. Here's the things guiding us. Leroy is dealing with the implications of that, which Wilson doesn't deal with either. So I don't want to get too lost in the meta ethics without dealing fairly with just the reality of what's being argued. Hopefully that makes some sense. But Leroy, so given what that pushback is, that objective morality doesn't exist even in your system, frame that as your critique of what Richard is saying or what Wilson is saying.
I will try.
Yeah, I know. It's a lot to. I'm sorry.
I remember years ago, I was listening to this guy talk. He says, can you imagine on a Sunday morning, people gather to go to church, and while they're in church, a big boulder rolls down the hill, runs through the church, and kills everybody in the church. He says the first question that people generally ask is, why didn't God stop the boulder? Right? Why didn't God stop the boulder? The next question he asked is, why do you want to live in a world where God stops everything evil from happening without stopping everything good from happening? In other words, you want to live in a world where nothing bad ever happens. I think that's a right desire. That's a good desire, to live in a world where nothing bad ever happens. But that isn't the world that we live in. And that isn't the world that we ourselves, if Christianity is true, chose. We chose to live under our own rules. We chose to live in a world where bad things happen, and often bad things that we create come to be. And in that world, God does rescue us in some ways. Those are what we call God's extraordinary acts in the world. But God's ordinary acts in the world are his providence, that you have light, that you have heat, that you have food to eat. God doesn't step in and prevent every bad thing from happening. That's not the world that we live in. That's not the world that we've created. It isn't to get God off the hook either, because, God isn't trying to get off the hook of that. God is allowing people to live in the circumstances that they created, and he interacts with the world to move it in the way in which he desires to do that. Now, I understand that a lot of people don't like that. What they want is a world where nothing bad ever happens to anyone, ever. And unfortunately, that isn't the world that we live in. That isn't the satisfying answer to people who want the world to be different than what it is. That just isn't the world that we have. The world that they desire, though, God promises in the future.
Okay. Well, it looks like there's at least some understanding here. So we got a good comment on that. So I guess the way I would also respond to that and then bring it back to the actual atheist argument side of things is I agree 100% with what Leroy has said. When I frame it to my students, I often put it this way. If you're out on a date and you go out and you meet somebody and you swipe right, you get together and say, oh, okay, let's hang out and get together. And instantly, this is not the person. Something's off. So you try to sneak away and get away from this person. You're running out to your car and all of a sudden you hear some footsteps behind. You feel a knock to the head. You wake up and you're chained to their water heater in the basement. And this person's standing over you saying, I love you. And we are going to be together forever. And you will love me and I will love you and you will have my children. And that isn't what we would determine as love, because love has to have a responsiveness. Love has to have some freedom of choice. Otherwise, it's just slavery. And so the Christian basic response to that problem of evil is that if we live in a world where love is possible, where the choice to love is possible, then there has to be a choice to allow for evil and destruction. So it's not that God doesn't help the Good Samaritan by the road. It's that he's given us the choice to do it. He's empowered us as his instruments to do that thing. And he allows for the suffering, and maybe he even causes stuff. It doesn't really matter. Knowing that difference between the two really doesn't, it's really irrelevant to the argument. He's sovereign over all those things. But part of that is a world that allows the freedom for the possibility of that relationship to exist, has to allow the freedom for the bad stuff to exist. And Christians then ultimately answer that and say, well, okay, there's ultimately going to be an end where justice is brought, even if we don't see that justice take place in our lives right now. So it's just a different worldview explanation for those same kind of things that Richard, as an atheist, is trying to explain. He's still trying to explain why those things are. It's just the atheist view is that there is no such thing as really moral evil at all. Like when you see the Good Samaritan, it's not that actually something bad is even happening. It just is. The question is, does my helping him either satisfy some selfish desire? Like, oh, if I save this guy, he's wealthy and he'll give me money. Or is he a part of my kin group or my cooperative group? And I need this guy for some group survival that will make my group stronger than the other group. So there's just a pragmatic solution in that worldview. So we're both trying to explain that in some way. The question is, which gives the better explanation, internally consistent, externally with the facts and information, and which is the more livable world that we want to embrace. So, Richard, let me kick this back to you then with that idea, because you've given your summary where you kind of just differ from Wilson. And I think, as best I understand what you're saying, is you're arguing that there's that third strand where in some ways, society, technology, some of those things help us overcome, or we can actually develop the right political system against what Wilson says to help us resolve that dualist internal struggle. But I think what that opens the door to, in my understanding, is still what historically would be that eugenic tendency of group selection. In other words, I've still got to decide what's going to make my group more survivable. And if I have people within my group or outside my group that is going to endanger my survival or our survival, then societally, there's a need to restrict the reproducibility of that group. There's some sort of effort we need to limit that other group from harming our group. And so we're still going to be left with that challenge. So again, the challenge being which human life is more useful to the group. Here's a scientific article. I think when I read this last week or the week before, I thought of you in this actually, because my basic thought from what you said before is I thought you'd offer what you did, your little difference with Wilson made sense. And I think this article maybe is more in line with what you're thinking, adding that ability to overcome that dualist struggle. So in this article is from Science Alert. It's human evolution may be undergoing a major shift right before our eyes. So the author Michael Starr he's summarizing this peer-reviewed article from Bioscience like this. He says, quote, "A seismic shift in the selection pressure acting on humans may have brought us a major turning point in our evolutionary journey." So he's talking about that evolutionary pressures that we've already discovered, that multi-level selection, whatever all those pressures are. So there's a change. So he says, according to multiple teams of scientists, human culture, technology, medicine, and our remarkable collaborative problem-solving skills, that would be the group level type selection, may now be shaping human evolution more than environmental pressures and the limitations of our bodies. This is because the solutions we invent to make our lives easier, from central heating to contact lenses, can solve biological challenges far faster than evolution can reduce the pressure of genetic adaptation. In other words, by using culture and technology to improve our lives, we may have created a feedback loop in which we must continue using them for survival. It's a controversial idea touching on concepts that echo the troubling history of eugenics and raising difficult questions about how far humans should go in using technology to sharpen our biology. So here's what I thought was interesting, what I want to kick to you, Richard, is if he's right, and whether our political system can help us modify or override in some way what Wilson is describing as this conflict, whether it's technology that can help us reproduce and develop and thrive as a culture against those those natural selective pressures. What happens if there's an EMP that goes off and all of a sudden our technology's gone away, or our government, like Iran, has been decapitated by some horrible, heinous attack, whatever that might be? Then we're just going to return to those natural selection pressures, and we're back to where we started. We're not going to survive. What are your thoughts on that? Does that make sense within your view? Would you view that as bad? Are we really truly overcoming what we think we're overcoming, or is it just a temporary mirage?
Well, I think a lot of what we're experiencing is an illusion. So I think that the technology and the things we're using creates another song. And remember the last podcast I said, we're all born and there's these cultural norms, these moral and intellectual standards, and these frameworks that society is already using around us. And all of those networks I think of those as like a song that songbirds sing. The community of songbirds have a song. When their birds are born, that song is waiting on those birds. And so just like the same thing for us, all these cultural norms were waiting on us when we were born. Now those norms are different and they're evolving. I think some of us will use them. And you're right. If we lose it, then our song, our community, our surroundings are suddenly vanished, and we're not going to know what to do. And so I think a lot of people who are living large right now, if an EPMP goes off, all their power, all their influence is gone. And then the guy who knows how to build a house, who knows how to get fresh water, who knows how to hunt, they're going to do better. And that kind of person right now isn't being represented by any political party, although each say they are. You ask them, ask that person who could do that, which politician he likes, and he'll probably have a hard time coming up with one. So yeah, we're going to use technology. We're going to use medicine to keep surviving, and then if we lose it, we're going to suddenly have a problem. So I agree with that guy that we have created a new song, and if we lose it, we're going to suddenly, especially our kids. I've got 2 high schoolers, and if we lose it all, both of them are going to have some degree of problem. I've taught them as best as I can, but this generation is using this technology a lot. They're going to have a problem.
So when that happens, though, if that were to happen, that scenario,
yeah,
then of course either our group cooperative level is going to have to kick in, and we're going to say, okay, there's limited resources, there's limited stuff, and we're going to have to decide which groups outside of our group we're going to be willing to eliminate so that we can survive on those things. But there's no moral claim there in your view, right? That's not morally wrong. We just say, okay, I need to wipe out that group of people so that my group of people survive. And you would have no moral qualms about that, right? Because that wouldn't be, it would just be what it is.
Remember, I'm completely opposite than what you just said. What you just said, if you put that through a not gate, that would be me. I'm completely opposite of what you just said. I say we will absolutely, because remember, we're all moral. We would say these other people, even people like ISIS today would say these people have to go. They morally have to go. That's a moral claim. So we would each say, yeah, these other people. Well, I say we. Some people would say, hey, let's try to all live together. Probably they would be killed first in a situation where everything's disastrous and all in chaos. I'm sure some people would say, hey, let's all just try to get along. Those people would probably die first. It's going to be people, and hey, I'm not saying this is good. I'm saying they're going to do it. It's going to be people who say, hey, the 20 of us, we're going to make it because we have some hunters, we have some guns, we have some equipment, and we're going to survive, and we're going to bring our families. Those guys are going to do well. And that doesn't mean they should or ought to. And then the people who lose are going to say they ought not to have done this to us. I say it's all a battle of momentum. So we're in reality, we're all in a battle. We're in the Thunderdome, so to speak. And when you're in the Thunderdome, what kind of person are you going to be? What kind of group are you going to belong to? And what kind of group, what are the actions and what are the intellectual and moral standards of that group? So it's very, very, very moral. The reason I say there's probably not a standard outside of all of us, a standard by which we judge, is because the owner of that standard won't stop the ISIS guys. He won't stop the post-apocalyptic, murderous rampagers. He won't stop them. And you're saying, hey, that's fine. That's how the world is. I'm saying, for whatever reason, he's not going to stop them. You're going to have to be prepared to survive in that situation or die. And then if you die, then you're no longer here to discuss it. So that's different than saying there's no morals. Everybody's moral. I'm just saying that there's no standard by which we all judge. We just think there is. Everybody thinks, even atheists who say religion needs to go, thinks, well, I'm just thinking about pure reason. Pure reason demands that there be no religion. So they're still appealing to something higher. I just don't know that that is really a real thing other than their certainty. But that's different than saying there's no moral. I think everybody's moral.
I think I think that you're right to surface the tension, and right to surface the absolute horror that would be.
Mhm.
But so what? I mean, I'm just being honest. Like, so what? I mean, this has happened in society several times. Like I explained to you earlier, once Pizarro killed the king. The king was the center of the Incan society. Their society collapsed and never came back.
I
Right?
know. No,
I mean,
no,
unless there's something inherently wrong with that, and there's something that will inherently be wrong with the situation after that, then I mean, I'm just not sure why it matters. We're just reporting about what is. I think the whole discussion that we've been having in it necessarily rests on a moral standard that says that if all of society collapsed because of an EMP and the resulting horror, the result would be horrible. I mean, I think that matters. I think that, if objective moral values and duties are true, then how people respond after that matters. But if objective moral values and duties are not true, it does not matter. No matter how horrible it is, no matter what society comes and goes and falls apart, it does not matter. I mean, on that view. I mean, I'm just looking at the existential issues that arise from the discussion, and I'm not dismissing what you say, because I think that what you're saying is you're surfacing something that's really important. That if the thing that holds society together falls apart and people are left on their own, then a lot of people would be harmed, and some people would survive. I think that your that whole discussion rests on this notion, and that notion is that it would be wrong, and there would be something wrong if an EMP went off and society degenerated into a horrible situation. And if it doesn't rest on that, then I just don't understand why it matters.
well, it does. It does
Let,
rest on.
Richard, I want you to respond to that, but let me just throw one other part to that question in. It's the same thing as Leroy is saying, but I just have my own additional thought to that. And then I do want to hear your response, specifically what he's saying.
Okay.
Like, not only why does it matter to me on a human level, but why does it even matter if humans will be wiped out? Because if humans are no different than the ants that you bring up earlier, we're just all group selected. It's all who survives, who doesn't survive. We have no moral distinction between us, no objective moral distinction. Let's put it that way. I agree with you. Morality doesn't imply good or bad. Morality is just the system that we use to guide our decision making. The Christian claim to objective morality says that there is some external good or bad by which we measure those decisions. You're just saying we all make moral choices, but there's no objective standard outside of that. So what does it even matter if we launch an EMP and we do nukes, and then all that survive are the cockroaches and the ants and a few other things? It's just is what it is. So there's no tragedy that happens with that. There's no, and I could be quote unquote sad if my kin group is eliminated, but that sadness is really just a biological response. It's not actually a real feeling. It's just a biological response that, hey, my line will end, my biological thing will come to an end. But if nature says that the ant is worth surviving and humans aren't, then it just is. So I don't know. I guess on that scale, I see Leroy's question is relevant. Why do we even care if humans get wiped out completely, let alone which groups get wiped out? So kick it to you then.
Right. And so these conversations go, and they have gone for decades. I completely understand that. Having had these discussions with Christians, imagine that there's 10 cultures and there's this horrible apocalypse, and one of those cultures is like Walnut Grove, like we talked about last time. Little House on the Prairie, Charles Ingalls, Walnut Grove. Some good people tried to take care of each other, honestly, genuinely want everybody to be okay. And then there's 9 other cultures that are just like, hey, they're like Sodom and Gomorrah. They're like, hey, man, everybody on his own. And if this Walnut Grove group is too weak to do anything about it, we're going to go in there and take them over. So you have these 10 cultures at odds with each other. And this Walnut Grove group that the 3 of us like better, and we hope that they win. Let's just say this happens in another reality and we're just watching it. We hope that Walnut Grove group wins. if they don't have enough Charles Ingalls, enough warriors in their town, they might very well be overrun by those other 9 cultures. And so I would join both of you in thinking that it's wrong that these other 9 cultures, and let's say the other 9 cultures do win, I would think that's wrong. I would think the fervent wrongness would hit me as hard as it hits the both of you. I would just say that even though we're experiencing that hit as if it's happening outside of humanity, and that there's just this wrong song, like I was saying before, the song of wrongness that's hovering above us, even though it hits me just as hard as you, I don't know that that really is a real thing. However, I'm going to keep acting as if it is. I'm going to keep thinking and acting. So like if the 3 of us were attacked or our families were attacked, I would defend all of us. If let's say our 3 families move together on a street in this apocalyptic event because we have enough weapons and knowledge to come up with a pretty good community, I would fight just as equally as both of you to try and stop that. Now, if we all die, we would probably, our last breath would be like, this is wrong, this is awful. And then in my mind, that's it, and we're done. Now, if somebody else could say, why did that matter? They're gone. Why does it matter now? I would say, okay, who cares? I would say, so what, back to that, because I'm still going to do it. Even if it's not based on something above me or objective above me, I still think it is, and I'm still going to act like it. And my actions are going to be what determines whether I'm still here or not. So, even if it's not something, my actions aren't going to be any different than either one of your actions. So my take is it might not exist, but it won't change my thoughts or behavior. And your thoughts or behavior is going to be what determines whether you're a group member or a good person.
Leroy, thoughts on that? Anything new to add there?
Yeah, I mean, again, like I said last time, I mean, I would love to have you as a neighbor. I mean, I think we would agree on like 90% of the things. I mean, we'd sit down and have, barbecues, get in our old man chairs in front of the house and just hang.
Yeah.
And I think, and again, I want to say that, in your discussion, there's a lot of good there. I mean, one of the things that I often tell myself, that when things start going wrong, the thing to do is to not panic. It's to carry on and to think as if I'm going to do the most good that I can at that moment. I think that is what we all should do.
Yeah. That's your zealotry, by the way. That's your zealotry.
Right. But if a pride of lions living out in the jungle or in the Serengeti, wherever they live at, runs across a herd of water buffaloes, those lions will eat those water buffaloes until they're all gone, until they have to move on and find other water buffaloes.
Yep.
And it is not wrong that they've eaten those water buffaloes, right? That's just what lions do.
Right,
lions eat water buffaloes.
The water
right?
buffaloes
That's what
would
they do.
Right.
I'm sorry?
The water buffaloes wouldn't be too happy about it.
They wouldn't be happy about it, but that's just what happened. Just what happens. And if an EMP hit the United States and we're all lost without power, and a large segment of our country would fall into disrepair and probably never be able to come back from it.
Right.
It would be a horrible thing. And I think we both would agree that it would be a horrible thing. And in that situation, we would do the most good for the most people that we can. And I think, if there is a God in heaven, then that is not just a good temporal thing, it's a good eternal thing, right? Because he's the one who is going to judge me for how I lived and how I carried on in those moments. And I think that's right if there is a God in heaven. But if there is no God in heaven, we're just like the buffalo. We just get eaten. And that's just the reality of the situation. No matter how much good we want to do, no matter how many, whether one lion stands up to the rest of the lions and said, hey, we shouldn't eat all the buffaloes. We should let some of the buffaloes survive, right?
The lion would be eaten if he said that.
Exactly. Or he'd be driven from the pack, right? the whole thing, unless objective moral values and duties exist, and there is a God to whom we will have to give an answer to at some point in history's future, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter how we feel about it. It doesn't matter whether we like it or whether we dislike it or whether we think it's right or whether we think it's wrong. It really wouldn't matter. I mean, when the Incans, fell to Pizarro and their community fell off the face of the earth, it's just what is, unless there is something more. And if there is something more, and I think even in your arguments, because I think you argue as if that deep down, that there is something more, and there has to be something more.
I do that. That's true.
Right.
Remember, that's my point. My whole ministry is that we all.
I agree with you. I think that is the voice of God, the Holy Spirit saying there is more here. There is more to all of this. And I mean, I guess that's where I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the funny part here, Richard, is that, I think you are ultimately arguing there is something objectively morally good and true. You just want to explain it through natural means, through natural things. But in the end, it doesn't, in my view, this is where people have to kind of figure out is you're not really actually explaining, you're not giving a justification why that objective thing is true cross-culturally, across all peoples. You're going from a is observation to making a meta-ethical claim. But then when the argument is, shown, it doesn't make sense. You say, well, that's true. But I'm just going to believe it anyway. I just choose to believe this thing. But you're choosing to believe a fiction that just doesn't survive. Yeah, go ahead.
And probably even beyond my conscious choice. Like I say, when it comes to morality, that comes from the back of our mind, from non-conscious algorithms, even before you're consciously aware of it. So for people listening to the audience right now, if someone asks you what's your favorite movie, you're going to consciously do analysis. But if somebody says, hey, is some atrocity wrong, there's no analysis required. It hits you immediately. And in fact, that's why a lot of people think there is objective morality, because without consciously doing any analysis, it just comes into the room and smacks you across it that's wrong. And you're like, whoa, where did that come from? I think it comes from our non-conscious algorithms in the back of our mind, which is why we're not consciously aware of it. So we do believe in things that aren't true, but we don't consciously think so. And so all I'm saying is, I think all three of us are living in illusion. And the fact that I'm agreeing with that and saying that I'm doing it doesn't mean that I'm better, because I'm not offering something other than existence. The only thing I'm offering to replace God is to say, well, you'll still be here. And that might not be enough. I mean, there's atheists who convert to Christianity simply because existence isn't enough. So I'm not saying that to ask people to become atheists. I just think this is how it is. And then I also want to say there's so many atheists who will fight back. When you tell them that they're acting as if God exists, they get so angry and they're like, no, not me. I'm just reasonable. I'm like, no, I think we all are. So that's one of the reasons why I do this. And there's Christian organizations and churches that have me come and speak specifically because they're looking for an atheist who will agree that we do all do that. I just have a different reason as to why we all do that. So it's another reason why I'm glad to be here, so that I can kind of get that alternate take out into the airwaves.
Yeah, I was thinking of C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man. Or is it The Abolition of Man? No, it's not The Abolition of Man. It is the book where it may be The Abolition of Man, where he explains the Tao. And what Lewis argues is that every society that has ever existed that we know about has a moral framework. Mm-hmm. Everyone that we know about has a moral framework.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that.
And the question is why? Why do we all have a moral framework? And if we only look at what is, we can't. The is can't really explain why things ought to be that way. But because they are that way, it causes us to ask, why is it that way that every society that has ever existed has a moral framework or a moral standard? Some societies come closer to that standard at some point in history, and other societies remain farther apart from that standard. But the very fact that they all frame the world the same way tells us that it's not an accident that people frame the way that world. And it seems, as you would say, be a part of people's way of seeing the world. As a matter of fact, it is so deeply embedded in the way that we see the world that we can't frame the world other than that. We can't even imagine a world other than that. And what I would say is that the existence of that framework where people come nearer or farther to it, and that it is so ubiquitous and so universal and so everywhere at all times, may tell us something about the way in which we were designed to live and function in the world. And if we were designed to live and to function in the world according to that Tao, according to that algorithm, as you say, then we should probably ask who designed it that way, because it's not accidental. And if we do ask who designed it that way, we might be able to discern something more than, and I think something better than, it's just the way that it is. We might discern something that this is a way in which we ought to live and a way in which we ought to treat each other. I just don't think it's an accident that men are created the way that they are. And maybe because the way they're created the way that they are is that we don't all destroy ourselves. We don't all fall into the lowest form of depravity that can exist. And maybe because we frame the world that we do, that men do rise up and say, no, this is not the way that things ought to be. This is the way things are, but it's not the way that things ought to be, and we need to do something about that. I think that the Christian explanation of that problem is not merely more satisfying. I think it's a better explanation than that this is all accidental.
Yeah, let me jump in with two comments here, because I think Richard, you're getting all the love off my YouTube channel here. We have a comment here talking about from Dogba Dave, just showing how he doesn't believe there's an afterlife or judgment. He doesn't really need a reason beyond just living now for why we do it. That doesn't make any sense to him to embrace that narrative, I guess, from his view. And then we have this comment: fireflies produce light, scorpions produce poison, humans produce meaning and morals. We do it naturally, which seems to be a lot of your argument here. But I think Leroy offers something as we start moving towards the end here that's really important. There's an assumption here on both sides. We have to make certain presuppositional assumptions about the nature of reality, the nature of who we are. But the question is, without question begging, which gives the best answer? So the question I'd ask you, and we'll still continue to unpack these on future shows too, is can you demonstrate that this undirected natural process produces the same complex social outcomes across, as Wilson puts it, dozens of independently evolved lines? Is that a more parsimonious or more simple explanation than the Christian argument that there's a designer who built cooperative capacity into the structures of life itself? But you'd have to answer that without smuggling in the assumption that design is impossible, which Wilson really does. He said, well, of course there can't be a creator, therefore I have to come up with an explanation for that. But the scientific process would say, here's two equally valid theories without the assumption of, is there a God or is there no God? And say, which theory is the simpler, more direct answer to that observational evidence that we have? And I would argue from a Christian perspective, the argument from design makes way more sense of those independently observable facts among species, which Wilson observes and which you've brought out. And that even if I don't like the conclusion of that, it seems to be the more reasonable or the more coherent answer to that, at least. So any thoughts on that as why you still come to the conclusion? What's your evidences for that natural selection could actually, there's a biological, mechanical explanation for these ubiquitous moral systems of cooperation and for selfishness, what's the evidence for that excludes the possibility of a God in your view?
One of the first things I like to point out, especially I was just speaking at a church on Thursday night. I was invited to a church to give a talk. One of the very first things that I say is that I don't demand that you exclude a God. In fact, if so many theists and atheists are fighting a wrong battle, they're fighting a battle where they're both assuming something, and this assumption is wrong. And the assumption is if we can come up with a natural explanation for everything, then there goes God. And that's not true. If we were to all figure out all the answers, space and time unfolded, here comes the laws, we come up with an explanation, and it becomes true. Let's just say all the evidence is there, and even religious scientists are all convinced, like, okay, all the cosmology, all of biology, here is the mechanical process that happened that led to us today. All questions answered. Some religious scientists are going to throw a fit because their whole ministry, their whole organization is based on the fact that God had to intervene at certain points. Some will panic and freak out. But then some organizations are going to go, what an amazing reality we live in. What an amazing reality that unfolded just so that now we're all here and we're all having these conversations. I can't believe that this happened naturally, but we can prove that it did. But there's got to be something behind all that. Theism will actually ramp up. More people will become theists. So this idea that God has to intervene, and not that you guys are demanding intervention, but so many people are. So many people are saying, hey, because I can't answer this question, this isn't God of the gaps. They're saying, I cannot find any answer here that has to be, and they're not saying I can't find it out of ignorance. You've got like Stephen Meyer, you got some of the smartest people in the world who are saying, I can't find any answer here. So that means there's probably not an answer. That's different than God of the gaps. But even that, if you fill in that gap with nature, it doesn't stop a creator. There could still be a creator. He just could have created reality to unfold in that way. So I always say, never mind whether we can dismiss a creator. We can't. There's no way to do that. So let's just say there is. But I do think that if that creator exists, he's not going to intervene in our fight. If something like the Reformation War happens, he's not going to stop that. It's going to come from up to us. We're going to have to stop that. So I always argue, rather than fight about whether a creator exists, think about what you're going to do. What's your song? What's the thing that you're zealous for? And then try to make sure that that's as sharp as it can be. And then there could be a creator behind that or not. It's just that even if he does exist, he's not gonna intervene and stop. It's going to be up to you, and it's going to be up to the community that you get yourself involved with. It's going to be the patterns that you live throughout the day. So I argue that more than it has to be nature without God. I'll just say it's probably nature, and if God's behind it, great, but he's going to leave it up to us about what we do with that.
Leroy,
one of my
put a little bow on some of this for us, man.
One of my favorite movies is Sherlock Holmes with Robert Downey Jr. Uh-huh. And in one scene, toward the end of one of the Sherlock Holmes, they're trying to forestall a war. And Sherlock Holmes is playing chess with Moriarty. Mm-hmm. And he said something in that scene that I really enjoy. I think it answers this question. Moriarty is like, how are you going to stop it? You're out here playing chess with me. Well, Sherlock Holmes trained Watson. And he says, yes, it is true that I am out here with you, but my methods are on the battlefield. My methods are on the battlefield. And what I would say, and what God might say here is, you might say that I am not there, right? You might say that I am not there actively, but my people are on the battlefield and they matter. And men who love the Lord, men who love God, will act in ways that will glorify God in those moments, even in the most difficult times, even if it costs them their very lives. And it isn't as if God isn't there. No, his methods, his people are on the battlefield. He does intervene. I mean, this is the whole point of the story of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan isn't good just simply because he does a good deed. He's good because he is an example of how God would treat a man who is dying, who was sick, or who was beaten badly on the side of the road. His people walk in and they help and they matter. So that's the illustration that I would say. But I guess that's how I would bow it. God's people are there and he will intervene through them.
Through them. I agree. Through them.
Yeah, so it's interesting as we go on these. I'll just summarize a couple thoughts here as we end our time. That I think there are certainly a lot of things we agree upon, and based on what we've dialogued on so far, I think a lot of that agreement, in my take, is because we live in a Western civilization that's been highly influenced by Christian morals and thinking and the teachings of Jesus. And so there's a lot of assumptions of what we take for granted within that framework. And so that explains why we do, Richard, share a lot of the same convictions. But my challenge for folks is not just why we share those, but what is the answer that makes the most sense of those things? Because ultimately, this would be the Christian framing of this. Jesus didn't die to make bad people good. He died to make dead people live. And if there is something beyond this life, if that is true, it's not merely enough to be good or act in kindness or show cooperation with our kinship group. It's also necessary that we have relationship with this God who created us for that reality that exists beyond this reality. At least there again, that's the Christian framing of this. So for the Christian or those questioning, this is why Leroy and I will push back and say, well, it's not enough just to be good or to compel ourselves to make morally good, quote unquote, choices, whatever that might mean for Richard or for anybody else on their own perception of reality. We'd argue that goodness, that impulse, that instinct, we have to explain what that is. And if God is the explanation, then that matters for not just now, but for life eternal. So that's my closing framing. Richard, I'll give you the last word on this, and then I'll close us off just to be fair to our guest here. Any last words for folks?
Yes. My closing thoughts will be on the Good Samaritan, which I think is a historical, accurate story in the Bible. I know I said story, but I think that historically speaking, Yeshua or somebody like Yeshua told this story about whether or not you should help someone who's one of them. You have the us and them tribalism that we all have that. And he says, what happens when you stumble across one of them who's not one of us, but he needs something? Even sometimes the people who are most likely supposed to help him don't help him. And then the ones who are least likely to help him does help him. Part of my zealotry song is that we should help them. And I think historically that actually was told to audiences back then. And I think it created a division. I think some people were like, no, you can't do that with them. And I think you'll still see that now. And so I do think that historically happened in the Bible. And I think it's important that you should consider also helping them, depending on what it is. But if someone's, in desperate need and they're one of them, I think that they should help. Obviously, if it's ISIS, I'm going to call the cops. But if it's just somebody who's, a Democrat, I'm going to help them. I'm going to make sure that they have what they need. So my closing thought is that the story of the Good Samaritan is important. It's part of my song, and I hope it's part of yours.
Well, that's a great summary, brother. Thank you so much. Well, let me close off by saying this. I want to thank everyone who joined us live, and I hope you'll join us for our next discussion on atheist ethics when we explore the question, does happiness lead to injustice? In the meantime, I'd like to encourage our Christian brothers and sisters to go out and start a conversation with an atheist friend and raise the roof on this inner conflict between selfishness and altruism. And finally, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting platform. And if you want to participate with me in a subscribers only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org. Take care all, and God bless.